So today's talk is called Guardians of Paradise, and the name for the talk is actually quite deep and obscure, because there's an assumption, first of all, that this earth is a paradise, and the guardians are so small that most of us wouldn't be able to see them unless we had a microscope. But I'll get into that in a moment. The first thing I'd like to do, which is how I would start any talk, is by actually offering thanks and gratitude and honoring the ancestors of this land. And the slide, although you can't see it that clearly on the board there, that's the place I live at the moment, and that's the center of a giant volcano that's called Wallumbin, or cloud catcher. And that's like a mountain in the middle of a crater. And the reason I've put gracias there instead of thanks is actually because gracias alludes a little more to the stains when you step into a very specific mode. And I'm going to get into that in the talk, because this is actually crucial for our time, is the way in which we feel, the way in which we hold a particular energy and frequency, and then how that affects everything around us, from the elements to nature, to each other, to our bodies, and how each one of us has the ultimate control in adjusting the environment. And most of us today, with the modern political system, feel very powerless because they feel like these massive movements, and we feel like one little person, and often we throw our hands in the air and go, well, what can I do? And so this talk is really about what we can do as individuals, and actually how much power we have when actually interacting with the earth and nature, and of course each other's. So I'm going to start off, and this is, so the name of the talk there, as I said, is called Gatekeepers or Guardians of Paradise. And it refers to bacteria and viruses and fungi. And even though these are very tiny, they're actually very formidable. Most of us knows that, some of the tiniest creatures can be quite potent. Anyone who's had a bacteriological infection or a virus realizes how powerful they can be. But a lot of their power isn't necessarily as individuals. Their power is actually as groups. So a whole group of bacteria will get together, or a whole group of viruses, and they can morph really quickly and create a field of change. Now, microbes are really the base of what we call living systems. They create oxygen, they create food, they create nutrients for plants at the base level, they trap nitrogen. They literally create the base materials from which everything else lives off and grows. And I'm going to explore that a little bit in this talk. But before I do that, I just wanted to say that the microbes are really very, very pervasive. And what we'll see is they form living films over everything. And these living films actually become the immunity of ecosystems, including our body, which is an ecosystem, but also the immunity of the planet itself. And beyond the capabilities of the immunity, they actually form a consciousness field. Now, I'm going to explore this empirically, but also from an interesting scientific perspective. And very soon you'll see how important these beings are, and what role they play, and how important they are for the future of the way in which we're going to evolve on the planet consciousnessly, but also how important they are for the planet's immune system. So it's estimated that these groups of beings, even though they're microscopic, that the microbes, including bacteria, fungi, and viruses, make up between 80 to 90% of the living mass of the earth. Now, because they're so teeny, in actual numbers, they probably make up 99.9% of the creatures on the planet. Now that's huge. In your belly button alone, they did a survey, there was 80 to 90 people they surveyed, 1,400 species of bacteria alone in your belly button. This is pretty incredible stuff. Now, of all of these creatures, they perform very specific and very important functions in the human being. Now, one of these functions is literally the digestion of our food. Now, what you see there on the screen is one of these groups of beings called the fungi. And the fungi are masters of breaking stuff down and making it available for the next cycle of building up. So they break down nutrients and minerals and make them available to the plant kingdom. And before I go too far into this talk, I really wanted to discuss with you Steiner's cosmology, which is really interesting because that puts a lot of what we're dealing with in perspective. So Steiner's cosmology is really interesting. Steiner's cosmology was humans were the first beings to come to Earth, and when they came to Earth, Earth wasn't even solid. So they were the first beings to come to Earth, but yet they were the last beings to take physical form. Now this is very interesting because out of human being unfolded the mineral kingdom, then the plant kingdom, then the animal kingdom, and then finally humans took a physical body to walk around in their greater body. And this is really significant because the reason we have kin with the minerals and the animals and the plants is because that's actually part of our body. And each one of these beings, bacteria, fungi, birds, fish, lizards, rocks, each one of them has the potential to be part of our existence in terms of healing, but also to impart to us a certain level of consciousness. Now, people who work with crystals, they will know this. This is quite a normal thing, just like the last speaker who was talking about elemental beings. They know that when you're talking about gnomes and fairies, to some people, these invisible creatures don't exist. But yet there are people who work in quite miraculous ways with these creatures, with these elemental beings. And so even though these, the creatures that I'm talking about now are quite invisible to the naked eye, namely bacteria and viruses and most fungi, they have a very important role in our ecosystems. And modern scientific research has showed that a forest, for example, a large tree may actually nurture a whole lot of seedlings quite a distance away and growing in the shade. And through linking up with bacteria in the tips of the roots and fungi, those fungi actually can shuttle nutrients from the large tree whose leaves would be bathing in the sunlight, and as it produces these complex sugars, it can shuttle them to these smaller growing plants. And people may say, well, what advantage is that? And actually there's a great advantage because plants actually function way better as a forest than they do as individuals on their own. And what I'm going to talk about a little bit later is a solar economy, is how plants actually function and trap light in a very specific way and form essentially a living temple of light. And I want to digress a little bit and talk about an ancient Brahmanic text called the Chogyam Upanishad. And in the Chogyam Upanishad, it says that the sun and the moon and the stars and all the planets and the oceans and the mountains all exist in a lotus-shaped temple in your heart. Now that may seem quite magical and fantastical, but modern quantum theory is actually bearing this out. And there's, for example, a physicist called Nassim Haramein, who some of you may have heard of, and he explains how there's a link between each atom, each cell, each human, that human and the Earth, that Earth and its solar system, that solar system and the galaxy, and onwards through to the whole universe, through a type of holographic or quantum entanglement that enables the small to represent the large. In other words, as above, so below. And I guess we need to look at, if we are representation of the greater community, in other words, if our body is a community, and for sure we're going to find out that it is, 90% of the living beings in our body are not us. So we comprise, in terms of the cellular tissue, 90% of our cells are not our cells. In other words, our body truly is a community. And as we know with any community, it's how we interface or function within that community which determines the harmony of that community. And the harmony of that community determines the harmony of its environment. Now this has been borne out by, for example, what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in Ukraine. But these relative harmonies or conflicts are the very things that occur in our bodies. And what we're going to see is we actually have a way to harmonize these communities and actually create a level of peace and cooperation that actually not only supports the human body in becoming really healthy, but it actually enables us to reach higher states of consciousness. And what we're finding is that individual health and that individual consciousness is actually vital to become a living, functional unit in the bigger community, in this case, Earth. So it's as important for an individual cell to have a level of integrity, and that individual cell would be like, that individual cell has to take up its own nutrients, get rid of its own waste, respire, and have a level of consciousness to be part of a greater community of the body. And what we found is when this community starts to break down, we end up with all sorts of immune system breakdowns. A lot of what we call cancer is really the disharmony within our cellular community. And so what we're going to find out is that to recreate those harmonies actually recreates health within the body. What we're going to learn from this talk is really about the true role of being human, of being a spiritual being in a physical body on Earth now, and how if we move towards a true solar economy, and that means everything else in nature is moving towards a solar economy. As you can see by the trees there in that little video, all of those trees are moving towards the light. And their measure of success is how much light they can capture and how they can turn that into complex sugars. But what we'll see is the whole community can actually be measured by this success. And so if we look at the whole planet, we're going to find that the most successful cultures on Earth are living within a pure solar economy. Now that got extrapolated into what we call today agriculture and forestry, and due to the way in which modern cultures actually use and pillage resources of the earth, what happens is it seems like you've got relative success of certain cultures if they happen to be raping and pillaging and stealing resources. But ultimately, if they want a truly sustainable way in which they're going to deal or dance with the resource of the planet, they have to cultivate a true solar economy. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk you through how we as individuals can create a true solar economy, not only within our body and not only within our communities, but within the greater Earth community. So this is kind of a bit of a bold claim. But what we're being offered as an alternative is essentially ecological destruction. And before, in the 60s, when people were talking about ecological destruction, with Rachel Carson, for example, talking about Silent Spring or pollutants, a lot of people were going, well, we don't really see that. And it's only today where we can see massive scale ecological destruction where we're actually going, well, where are we actually headed? Because it's difficult to see back then, but it's very clear today that if we continue the way in which we're functioning right now, our modern cultures will basically destroy the planet and ourselves as well. So one of the questions I've asked is essentially, is God a DJ? And I know it's a bit of an obscure question, but we're at a festival, there is a bit of music. A lot of people here may have been to festivals and have a level of cognizance of what music is. And music's a kind of interesting thing because it's something we can't see, it's invisible, and yes, the way in which it interacts with us moves us. It moves us in some ways that it can actually get us to get up and dance, and yet it's invisible. Okay? Now, imagine you walked into a room like this, and there was a sound system here with a DJ playing music, but you were deaf. You would be able to experience a whole lot of people dancing in a level of unison. And if you try to look very carefully for the leader, who they were all following, you may find it would be quite difficult for that to actually occur, right? But if you looked carefully, you may think they were all synchronizing and there was a leader. If at some stage you could hear, what you'd be able to see is that they're not actually dancing with each other at all. What they're actually dancing to is an external signal. And this is the music. And so they all synchronizing or dancing to the music, and to an outside observer, they're actually all dancing together. Now this very example is used as to how nature actually coordinates, how all our cells in our body can work in a level of unison, how these groups of cells can organize and become organs, and how they can actually do very sophisticated work. Now, an organ in the body, like a kidney or a liver, is very similar to an ecosystem on the planet. They serve very specific functions. And in the overall scale of the planet, these functions are creation of things like clean water, air, food. But some of the things that we don't actually see are things like immunity. Now, I'll give you an example. If it wasn't for mosquitoes and malaria or mosquito-borne diseases, probably half of our tropical forests that we have today, we wouldn't have anymore. They'd already be logged and we wouldn't even know about it. What stopped that logging... Oops, we've had a little bit of a crash in the system here. Sorry, I'll try and do it while I'm doing this. I think Keynote just crashed, but I'll yeah. Okay, is there anything? Yep, back on. So if anyone was listening, where was I? Mosquitoes. Okay. So when mosquitoes are seen in this instance as quite the baddies, here's a mosquito, it's bearing a disease like malaria that's potentially fatal, and us contracting that as individuals is potentially fatal. But in terms of the forest, these are protectors or guardians of that forest, because without them, those beautiful hardwood forests would have been logged. Now, just a side note, cacao, or the source of chocolate, the number one pollinator are male mosquitoes. So there we go. Without mosquitoes, we probably wouldn't have chocolate. That's not bad. Now, what happens is, in the body, we have a similar type of scenario. I'm going to jump through this slide because it's actually going to be not as technical. But so we have a similar process in the body. It probably would surprise many of you to know that the gut is external to the body. Now, this sounds a bit bizarre, but really, the stomach is a specialized pouch, and it's outside of the body in a tube that links your mouth to your butt. Now, this is very important because when we're eating food, we're actually not eating food for ourselves. We're actually selecting food and chewing food and swallowing food for the gut microorganisms that live in our stomach. And this, you may think, is quite bizarre, but this is actually what people have been doing for thousands of years. And in fact, to facilitate that, what they've been doing is they've been eating foods that are pre-digested. And you may go, what are you talking about, Dan? So I'm going to give you a little example. Pre-digested milk could be yogurt or cheese. We're literally taking milk and we're feeding it to lactobacillus or a fungi, which is going to eat that milk and start this digestive process. We could take cabbage and make sauerkraut, or kimchi, or kombucha, or kefir. In fact, if we look around at all the different cultures in the world, and it's no surprise that they're called cultures, because we're cultivating and culturing microorganisms outside of the body, what we find is virtually every culture on the planet has different forms of ways in which they ferment or pickle their food pre-eating it. And what they're doing is they're starting the digestive process outside of their stomach. And what that does is it means that all of a sudden to the body there's a whole gamut or a whole range of nutrients available that weren't actually available before. And so this becomes really interesting because when we go through medical school, they don't teach you about nutrition. And when you study as a nutrition, they don't teach you about medicine. And yes, these two things are deeply interconnected. So we're not taught about what we eat is really important to our health. But to the Chinese or the Indians, this was vitally important. It was so important that they reckon about 80% plus of diseases start within the gut. So what this means is by just keeping a healthy gut garden, by just keeping a healthy community, is really where our immune system comes from. Now, the immune system in the gut, most people may not realize, but the consciousness system of the gut is really obvious. To science, 90% of your serotonin is produced in your gut. 90%. Up to 90% of your dopamine is produced in the gut. Now let me explain what serotonin and dopamine are, because they're actually very interesting brain chemicals. Serotonin is responsible for your daily waking consciousness. That means right now, sitting here and listening to me, most likely the brain chemical that's being used is serotonin. So what enables you to hear the words and see some of these pictures up here on the screen means that the chemicals that are allowing you to perceive what it is I'm saying in a very particular way, using your mind, are produced by a bunch or your community of microorganisms in your gut. Now this has all sorts of incredible implications that I'm going to get into in a little while. But before that, I'm going to actually pose some interesting questions which will get those microorganisms producing that serotonin and get you thinking about some of what's really critical to what's happening on the planet now. So what if we are immortal, time-traveling spirit beings? Avatars, if you prefer, that incarnate through and into the earth plane, into the goddess head, by traveling through a birth canal and growing a bio-flesh suit in which to complete our mission here on earth. What if the beings that wish to control us and the planetary resources of which we are meant to be stewarding know that by universal law they need our consent to access the precious resources of biology, genetics, and attention, and to get our consent they use fear and ignorance to force this consent. Now this is kind of starting to get into some pretty interesting territory here. What if these beings know that to tap this energy from the planet they need to disarm and distract humans and their plant, animal and micro allies, our microbiological immune system, using a full spectrum array of disruptive frequency, lowered immune system and mind control? Government is literally, the word governmentus means control of the mind. What if this connection is purposeful? What if we have repeated this cycle before, of awake and asleep, and left ourselves the best clues that we could that would withstand time and transcend language? Could these possibly be some of the ancient monuments that we have littered around the English countryside, for example, all the stone circles? In Egypt, pyramids. Throughout our planet we have ancient temples and megalithic monuments that we don't quite understand, but they allude to very specific things, and often they are to do with tracking different planets, and most of which are to do with tracking the sun. And I'm going to get into that in a moment. What happens if our planet was designed as a living library, an ark, to seed other star systems with life, and its control was fought after through time? It has been suggested that the earth and human bodies share abilities, like I discussed earlier, as above, so below. And some of you may or may not believe that the earth, along with the human, has a whole bunch of what we call city powers. Now these are powers of teleportation, powers of telepathy, bilocation, healing at a distance, time travel. Now, some of these may sound quite fantastical, and some of us may have read books like Autobiography of a Yogi, which allude to other cultures, especially some of the more ancient and spiritual cultures, being able to perform many of these city powers. But what happens if each one of us, our bodies, could actually perform these, and they were actually quite standard issue to the body, if only we had the instruction manual on how to use them? And so what I'm going to actually start to look at is how do we download that instruction manual directly from nature. And that's going to be called the reset. What happens if our time spacesuits were constructed out of infinitely renewable living units that were adaptive, self-repairing, and essentially immortal, and could continually upgrade to suit a number of different climates, conditions, and terrains, and indeed could morph and adapt by belief? What if these cells had synergistic relationships with other cellular beings and traded resource and energy and awareness in a mutually beneficial way? Is not our mitochondria, the energy generation part of the cell, not bacteriological in origin? Now, for many of you who may not know this, the way in which our cells actually take up energy from the field is through the mitochondria, which is a part, it's a cell organelle, and it's a part of the cell, but that is an ancient bacteria that the cell has incorporated. So we've got a synergistic relationship between a cell and a bacteria, which is how our cells extract energy from out here. Now, what I'm going to show you is that the natural energy cycles, most of which are actually a way in which other creatures interact with sunlight, trap that sunlight and trade it. And they trade it in a very specific way. What if the introduction of monotheism out of Egypt via Moses or Akhenaten and seeding the Middle East birth portals with Islam, Judaism and Christianity was part of a program to suppress Sophia, the feminine aspect of the divine as explored by the Gnostics, in order to keep war going and create the very disruption needed to keep control of the planet, her custodians and allies? The Gnostics, in case you didn't know, were the 1600-year-old sect, and they were one of the first to be put down by the Inquisition and the Crusades. And essentially their religion, if you want to call it a religion or spiritual tradition, was connecting directly with the divine. And they saw the divine in two aspects. There was a masculine aspect of the divine, which was in the invisible God. And the feminine aspect of this divine was called Sophia, or the physical God that we know, or the goddess. And so between the God and the goddess, they comprised the unseen Godhead and the seen Godhead. And to the cultures that lived on the earth, who you could group roughly as pagan cultures, their relationship with the physical world was that everything was sacred and everything was alive. And this is particularly important today because of what's going on in the Middle East. If you see the conflict that's occurring between the Jews and the Palestinians, if you knew that there was particular beings whose interest it was to continue that particular conflict in Palestine at the moment, and you could see what they were doing and how they were doing it, it would start to make a whole different level of sense. And so I'm just briefly going to touch on that, seeing as it's so current in what's going on in the Middle East. So, what if the remembering and reawakening of Sophia and who we are awoke the planet to fulfill its destiny? What happens if all these ancient stone temples literally came back to life? What happens if the sacred sites actually were part of a giant technological machine that engaged with our body energy would start up and create a whole nother realm on earth? And what I'm going to talk about is actually how we as individuals not only have the potential to do this, but really the responsibility. So there was a guy called Dr. Moto, and most of you may have heard of his wonderful work. And his work is really about how water records the level of consciousness that is projected from living beings and acts as the living liquid crystal that joins all these living beings and shares this memory, shares this information. Now, this isn't so strange an idea. Today, our modern crystalline technology like computers and iPhones will record information in zeros and ones on those crystalline silicon chips and share that information. So a crystal may be able to hold vast amounts of information. Within the bonding angle of the hydrogen and the oxygen, within a water molecule, it holds, exactly like the silica, a memory, and can hold that memory of everything it's ever come in contact with and touched, and a whole bunch of stuff it hasn't. In other words, what Dr. Emoto showed is that by just telling a glass of water that you loved it compared to telling another glass of water that you hated it, using those two waters to grow the same rice would get different results. And this has been borne out in many, many examples. So what that means is, how you feel emotionally, how you walk along the earth, and what you radiate as a consciousness field literally affects everyone and everything else. And I'm going to give you some examples as I progress in my talk, but those two things are diatoms, and that skeletal structure that you see there is actually built out of silicon crystal. Now I'm going to pose another one of the questions, which again is still really an intro into my talk. But what if the microbes that I've been talking about that live in our gut and cover the surface of almost everything, in the atmosphere at 30,000 feet, there's clouds of microbes, and these clouds of microbes not only change the actual light as it comes into our planet, but actually act as a planetary immune system. And so that's why earlier when I listed chemtrails as one of the things that are undermining that planetary immune system, is that chemtrails may even be killing that layer of bacteria, which is exposing us to a whole different level of frequency that, if any of you wants to research, can find out. You just need to Google geoengineering, and you'll see what's actually happening in the atmospheres of our planet and how that's actually affecting the water and the soil and us as living beings. So what happens if the microbes not only defend the planet and its beings from incarnating invaders using disease as a weapon in a scenario much like War of the Worlds, but also create an evolving, living, adaptable matrix, the immune system of the planet Earth? Humans have to pass through a birth canal for successful integration onto the planet. And, this is a very interesting story. It just so happens that the birth canal of your mother happens to be right near the anus. Now this is kind of quite shocking, because at first thought we may think, well, is this a design flaw? This poor child's head is coming out right where, the fecal matter exits the body. But when we look carefully at how vital it is, not only for the vaginal walls to squeeze the head of the child and activate a whole bunch of acupressure points on the head, shoulders and body, but to actually inoculate the baby with its first microorganisms in its gut, which it's now going to use to digest its food. So around the nipples, on the areola, are very specialized microbiological colonies just to inoculate the baby's gut with microorganisms to digest milk. So there'll be lactose digesting bacteria like acidophilus and lactobacillus. So what we're going to find is that the human body is perfectly designed to be covered with different colonies of microbes to actually make that living body, that new baby, robust and able to survive in the world. What they've started to show now is that babies who have cesareans and who are not breastfed are not only intensely immunologically compromised, but by age of 6 months can be up to 3 weeks emotionally and mentally and immunologically retarded. Think about that, because that's really incredible. That means that today, through convenience of having cesareans, we are literally breeding a generation of beings that are predisposed to a whole new range of viruses and bacteria. They're predisposed to chemicals and carcinogens, way more so than babies who are being born through the womb. So as spiritual beings, growing physical bodies, having to come through a mother, is actually a form of a gateway to protect this planet, so that not anybody could just arrive and zip on one of these biological suits and walk around, because very soon these microbes would take those bodies apart. And so what happens is we go through a very specific indoctrination process as we birth through our mothers and grow ourselves a skin suit that enables us to synergistically walk around on the planet. Now, this is cutting edge science that's being discussed now about how do we actually build up immune systems. Now we've gone down this path of using antibiotics and killed vast swathes of our immune systems, vast swathes of our intelligence systems. I mean, you don't need to look far to see not only are our modern Western communities suffering from a pandemic of gut diseases, but they're also getting dumbed down. So how do we remedy this? What if fields of microbes linked by infrared frequency could join to form a giant organism with cloud-like intelligence and non-local awareness, forming a living matrix of informational access? Well, bacteria produce the planet's soils, its nutrients, its air, its water, its living energy, and bind living communities. What if they could produce chemicals to regulate consciousness itself? And what evidence is there to support this? What is our true purpose of having a physical body and being able to walk around in that body on Earth? What I'm going to suggest is our body is actually like a type of vehicle which enables us to reconnect and awaken not only our internal body community, but the external community. Not only our human brothers and sisters, but our animal, plant, and microbiological communities, as well as the elements. It's up to us to remember that our bodies are connected to everything in multiple ways and act as portals and anchors, and combining the use of tools and seeds, we allow our bodies to act as a bridge between spirit and matter, heaven and earth. And these tools are ancient, inherited, ancestral wisdom of the earth. So how to heal with herbs is one of these tools. A seed, one seed, is not just a single tree. That one seed will grow a tree within thousands of seeds. And those seeds will literally grow the forests of the earth. So to understand how nature works and what role we have as being the earth stewards and custodians becomes crucial if we actually want continued existence on this planet in a relative harmony and living in the beauty of nature, or living in boxes that ultimately will lead to human death and eco-demise. So these tools are the ancient inherited ancestral wisdom of earth and cosmic harmony revealed by maths, sacred geometry, language, temple, megalithic sites, and alliances with the natural world in the form of traditional healing, traditional building, energy generation, and of course what we call art. So what is a community and how do they function? So as I said, our living communities that we live within in terms of the human beings, like our external community, are mirrored by our internal communities. And so, for example, what happens in our stomach depends on what happens to that community of beings in our stomach, depends on what we eat. If you eat lots of sugar, you'll invariably breed yeast-forming bacteria, a lot of which some of us know about, like Candida. But what does that Candida do? Now, those candidas, what they're going to do is they're going to produce enzymes to break down sugars and give you a little bit of a quick energy hit, but they're also going to produce brain chemicals to enable your body to choose more sugars. So we find we end up in an addictive dance because these yeast cells or these candida are going, ooh, that's a nice piece of chocolate cake. Get us that chocolate cake over there, that pizza over there, and that bottle of Coke over there. And of course we go, ooh, that'll taste good. And we drink that and we eat that. And of course our gut bacteria, in this case our candida, go, that was fantastic. How about some dopamine? Does that feel good? Do you feel good now? And of course we end up in these cycles with these organisms, and when we overbreed specific ones in the colony, in this case candida, they create all sorts of havoc in the body. But you know what? The spirit being, who's basically now lost its level of consciousness, that's being given a different overlay of consciousness by the candida, thinks everything's going just swell. And therefore eat more and more sugar, even though it's poisonous and even though it will now be killing the rest of the community. Now this may sound familiar. We've got a community out there which recently there were riots all around the world complaining about the uneven opportunities given to 1% of the people on earth, where the other 99% of the people of Earth were essentially like slaves working for those 1%. Now this pattern's starting to become familiar, not only externally, but internally in the body. And so how do we redress this balance? How do we start to act like the true communities that we are? How do we bring the different beings that comprise our internal communities and external communities, not only into harmony, but into a form of beneficial balance, where the beings that are interacting with each other are interacting in a synergistic way, where there's win-win situations, not these ones triumph and the rest of you guys suffer. So, how do we do that? Well, across every surface of every leaf, of the ground, of our bodies, of every building, every kitchen surface, we're told by people trying to sell us antibacterial scrubs, are a veritable community of microorganisms. And I'm going to use the analogy of a forest because this is really easy to see. If you come in and you clear fell a forest, let's say a forest that actually has a climax ecosystem, which means every niche is filled. What happens is as you cut down that forest, the first thing that reappears are essentially what we call the weeds. They're the pioneer plants. And these guys are the tough guys. They're the new, when you start a new community and it's in a poor neighborhood, the tough guys end up on the street controlling everything. And this is what happens. Your first level of inhabitants are weeds. And they're designed to be tough, and they're getting the soil ready for the next successional group of plants. And because they're tough, humans trying to get rid of them have a real issue with them, because these plants are designed to spread easily. There's tons of their seed. They're very resilient. And this is the exact same thing that happens in your body when you take an antibiotic. The first thing that happens is it wipes out 90 or 99% of the living organisms in your stomach. As I said, these are the guys that digest your food. How are you going to get nutrients now? So immediately the body starts to refill, but it's going to refill with essentially what are the weeds of the bacterial world. They're pretty tough, they do a rough job, but they're not very effective and they're not very efficient, and there's very little biodiversity. That means your immune system is very susceptible to every little virus and bacteria that's non-beneficial that comes along. So people who've had antibiotics a lot at a young age may find that they're very susceptible and sensitive to all sorts of chemicals, and their immune systems play havoc with them. And what we're doing is we're repropagating this in the world. So we've got things like hospitals where we've been using this clear filling technique of microbial scrubs for so long that we've now bred super duper bacteria. We're talking about diseases that now have no known cure, and they concentrated in hospitals. This is just from bad medical practice. You go into the farmlands in the American Midwest, we've bred plants and plant pests that are so tough that no known chemicals kill these guys. And the ones that do are so toxic they kill humans too. There's combine harvesters that are going over cornfields that are so tough they need Kevlar tires. What are we breeding? So what's the solution? How do we actually get back into the softness? How do we actually re-engineer ourselves into biodiverse living systems? I mean, look at that virus over there. Looks like it was built thousands of years ago by a type of nanotech. It looks like a machine. So I'm going to get into that, of what may have been the source of viruses and bacteria and why they are so important. Very recently, a side note is clouds of bacteria have now been discovered coming off rainforests and act as the seeds for water droplets to form on. And so literally rainforests create rain. And they do it in two ways. One is the bacteria forms the seeds of the water droplets, and the other is, as we'll see, that groups of bacteria create essentially clouds joined, much like our internet clouds of information, joined by infrared frequencies, and they create a vibrational field that literally attracts rain. It's a living field that literally makes rain. Now this is really interesting because it's this field that cultures manipulate when they want to be rain-making cultures, and there are many of them. What I have been given or offered is that after, I think, Hugh's talk, or another, I have another talk which I'm going to go into. What's that? At 8:30, which I'm going to go into the relationship of the sun to all these living beings. And so right now I'm going into a little more depth about what microbiology is. And I wanted to just have an interesting sidetrack story about how pervasive our gut microorganisms are in terms of creating our character. Now there's a doctor in Sydney who does what's called a fecal matter transplant. In plain English, he transplants healthy people's shit into the stomachs of unhealthy people who have had so many antibiotics, so many chemicals like maybe chemotherapy, that it's totally destroyed their gut microorganisms. And so when they get the feces of a healthy donor, not only do their bodies regenerate in amazing ways and they get rid of ailments they may have had for years, but a very strange thing happens. They actually gain a large part of the characteristics of the poo donor. Now this is amazing because we've all now know from science that if you get an organ donation, like a kidney or a heart, you gain some of the characteristics of that organ donor. But what we didn't know is you get even more characteristics from a donor that donates their shit. That means a large part of the characteristics of who we are is coming from our gut. Now this is stunning. And so what I'm going to go into later in the talk is how different cultures have used different things, like ayahuasca, like San Pedro, like dark rooms and sitting in caves, to actually reset, how they can do fasts and shifts in their diet to literally reset the consciousness of their gut microbiome in order to awaken. And so I'm going to go into that for anyone who's interested, and just stick around. But what I'm going to say is we need to learn what the difference between bad shit and good shit is. Because literally, this good shit can save our lives. So, it's impossible to understate how important the gut microbes are for our health and our consciousness. And for those who are interested in doing further research, there's a lovely book out called GAPS Diet, which is Gastrointestinal and Psychological Syndrome Diet, where a lady has shown that ADHD and ADD and autism and leaky gut and colitis and gluten intolerance, all of these are all actually linked. They're all linked in a psychological and immunological syndrome, and can be healed just by manipulation of the diet. And she changes people's diets, and in this instance she was changing children's diets and reversing young stage autism, changing children's diets and reversing ADD. Now think of what's going on, for example, in America, where in certain areas up to 60% of children are on antipsychotic and antidepressant pharmacological drugs. We are looking at a pandemic of immune system breakdown. And let me tell you that when your community starts to break down, that is contagious. This affects everyone. So, what are we going to do about it? How are we going to shift to basically reintroduce this planetary immune system? How do we become, as individuals and groups, a vector of contagion for positive immune system and for positive consciousness? And what we're going to see is that the body is actually incredibly designed to do just that. What we've found out, what we've learned in modern contagion scenarios, is that there can be a flu virus, and very quickly, within a small group of people, that flu can spread. But what we haven't been told is that actually positive beneficial contagion spreads as well. So what we may look at in our online Facebook communities is a positive meme spreads. And what do we call that spread? Viral spread. Those positive memes can spread and infect people with good ideas as easily, if not easier, than bad ones. And this becomes vitally important, because what actually happens is that it's easier for us to contagiously spread health than it is for us to spread disease. Now, of course, there's a lot of people, a lot of industry, a lot of money whose main interest it is to maintain certain levels of ill health, because huge amounts of corporate money are based on us remaining sick. There's even conspiracy theorists who will tell you that those very companies producing vaccines and pharmacological medicines are the ones producing new strains of viruses and bacteria that are non-beneficial, just so that they can sell us these medicines. Now, I don't want to go into conspiracy theory, even though I just did, because it doesn't necessarily benefit us. Just so you know, I mean, you can see these beautiful funguses that are forming on some rotting wood on the forest floor. Not only are they beautiful, not only are they connecting all sorts of biological beings like trees and animals through to nutrient systems, but they create an incredible habitat, incredible habitat of connectivity that's much like our internet in terms of the way in which they connect and share information. Now, what you can see sitting on one of those mushrooms is a mosquito. And what I want you to just be wary of is that mosquitoes can carry some of these contagious diseases, and very recently some companies, the Monsantos and Syngentias of the world, are actually genetically engineering mosquitoes, they tell us, to stop things like malaria. But in actual fact, they've become the new vectors, and this could be part of the drive of spreading infectious diseases through inoculation with mosquitoes. And so I want you to be very aware that there are GMO mosquitoes, and there are tests being conducted while, as I speak, in the Grand Cayman Islands, in the Caribbean. If anyone's interested in this transgenic agenda, you're welcome to come and see me outside of this particular forum, because it's pretty dark stuff. So there's some E. coli, very common gut bacteria. And like I said earlier, the very word culture comes from humans' relationship with these living cultures. And the more harmonic those relationships are, the longer those cultures and the healthier those cultures are in terms of their longevity over what we call true civilization, as opposed to what today passes as civilization, which is probably more like uncivilization. Brings me to that interesting joke that when the British asked Gandhi what he thought of Western civilization, he said, yes, that would be a good idea. That's kind of funny. Just you can laugh. So you can stop me for 10 seconds. And the reason it's called Keys and Codes is because it actually puts out a very interesting field. Now the brain puts out a field round about that big. The heart puts out a field round about this big to your fingertips, and I'm saying round about. But the body itself puts out an energetic field. Some people can see this field. It could be called an aura. But what it does is it's an interface between your physical body and spiritual bodies. And these non-physical bodies are vital in terms of this communication. And I'm going to give you an example. If you take 2 petri dishes of bacteria and you give one of the antibiotic, there'll be a massive die-off. But what they'll do is they'll signal via an infrared signal, and the petri dish next door them will experience an equivalent. In other words, those bacteria will act as if they're under attack, as if there's a genocide occurring, just by communicating with the bacteria in the petri dish next door. Now they've taken polarized filters and put them in between the petri dishes and then killed these ones, and these ones don't react. So they've been able to show that method of communication. Now they did this on a much larger scale. They had 3 chicken farms. One chicken farm over here, one next door, and one about 10 kilometers away. And what actually happened was they gave these chickens antibiotics. And within 24 hours, the chickens in the farm next door were acting as if they had had antibiotics. And within a couple of days, the chickens 10 kilometers away were acting as if they had had antibiotics. So what you're actually seeing is the chickens, or in this case, human beings, can actually communicate. In other words, my bacteria all over my body and in my gut are communicating with all of your bacteria right now. And what they found, and this is really important, is that if you have a very strong, integrated bacteriological community, it creates a field that's so strong that other people coming into your field, their bacteria can upgrade, in other words, can communicate to yours and come into a synergistic alignment. In other words, you can literally heal by coming into someone else's field who has a very powerful immune system and a very powerful consciousness. This is called entrainment. And this is happening in modern healing circles very often. In fact, there's stories of beings like Buddhas or Christ where people have literally come into their field and been enabled to experience miraculous healing just by entering that field. But what I'm going to go into is that the heart is the central cognitive organ. And this is the organ that actually communicates with nature and the natural world. And it actually creates a signal which harmonizes and synchronizes the microbiological world in our gut and on the surface of our skin. And that field, once it's coherent, is so strong that it's non-local. Now, what do I mean by this? This means that if you have a strong enough consciousness field, it means that people on the other side of the planet can tune into that. And most of us have had some form of experience of this. We've thought of a person and they've called straight away. So what we call telepathy is actually a living, linked consciousness field that is regulated by this microbiome in relationship to the human consciousness field. And I'm going to give you some more of these examples as we move on. Now, there's a nervous system in the body. I've called it the vagus nerve, which is actually a play on, Las Vegas, because it's actually spelt differently. But the vagus nerve actually connects various vital parts of our body. But along this nerve, microbes can actually travel directly into the brain. In other words, the microbiological community, and like I said, that some of the newcomers may have missed, 90% of the body's serotonin, the chemical responsible for our waking consciousness, is produced by this gut microbiome and fed directly to the brain. So if we do not take the responsibility of waking consciousness into our own hands, then the microbes create one default for us. That's what most of the people walking around on the planet are doing. They are set into default mode. I mean, how many of us, for example, are aware of what our bodies are digesting right now, of our immune system and what it's doing, of our respiration, of what our kidneys are doing, how they're filtering our blood and producing urine? So what we're aware of is the tip of an iceberg, maybe 1% of the consciousness that's occurring in our bodies at the moment we're actually aware of. It's teeny. What happens is many of these old world cultures, like the Indian culture using Ayurveda, like the Chinese culture using Qigong and traditional Chinese medicine and the manipulation of Qi in the body, have learnt how to supply this microbiological field with energy called Qi or prana, and to actually bypass that bacteriological or microbial consciousness field and actually step into the awakened human consciousness field. And a very interesting thing happens when this happens. What happens is the central cognitive organ engages, which is actually the human heart, and it creates a synchronized energetic field, and it coordinates all of living fields that we know of, from crystals to plants to animals. And so an awakened human is regarded as the true steward or custodian of the planet. And when those biblical texts talked about human having dominion over the planet, that may have been a slight mistranslation, because what actually we have as a role as being humans on the planet is to cultivate this field, which we could call love, and to hold that frequency in the heart, because that literally foments a fructifying or a harmonic living field as we walk and talk through the environment. And so we have, as a human being, an intense responsibility to become an earth custodian, to step up to our designed roles of holding this frequency that we call love. And if we cannot, we should be looking at higher orders of beings to learn from them. The sun is one of these beings, and the symbol of the sun, which I'm going to get into later, the birth or the dawning of the sixth sun, is really the rediscovery that the sun is literally the heart. And we're going to learn about what alchemy is, why gold was so important to our ancestors, how to literally use the alchemy of gold to awaken the consciousness of the heart and to step into our roles as these custodians of earth. I did actually mention this before. This was about transplanting the gut mind. But I did want to actually say that some cultures share these gut bacteriological communities in very specific ways. And the way in which they do that is sharing food together, is maybe kissing, is touching. And what happens is, as we share these bacteriological communities, we actually create fields, consciousness fields, communities and societies of awakened beings whose guts and whose gut bacteria have particular frequencies. There's shamans in the Amazon that build up, through their use of plant medicine and things like ayahuasca, build up such an incredible gut community that to some of the high initiates, they can produce in a trance an ectoplasm out of their stomachs and into their mouths, which they feed to the initiate. So the initiate can eat that and take on all their plant and animal allies, as well as that base level of consciousness. Now, this is pretty wild. But what we see is other things where we get the use of manioc in the Amazon, and the elders actually chewing this and making the foods, but the elders are chewing it and transferring their gut microbiome to the community. Can you tell me roughly how much time I've got?
We're just trying to work it out.
Because my clock keeps resetting because it jumped out. All right, so I'll keep going.
You've had an hour and 10.
An hour and 10. So
20 minutes.
I should be one. What's that?
20 minutes.
I've got 20 minutes more. Okay. So I briefly discussed what it is to being born into bacterial bliss. This means how much better prepared we are as beings if we birth through the birth canal and are given the bacteriological load from our mother's stomachs through her feces. And so that birth into bacterial bliss is encouraged, for our kids to be walking around and putting things in our mouth used to be more encouraged. Today we've got so many chemicals, so many antibiotics that it's a little more discouraged. But back in the day, it was encouraged for kids to walk around and put everything in their mouth, because this is what literally gave them their immune system. Now there's a story from the Vedas. Now the Vedas are a 5,000-year-old text out of India. And one of the stories about the Vedas is that there's only one virus. And this virus is a super conscious being. And what this being does is it morphs constantly into diseases to show humans where they are stepping outside of harmony with nature and their fellow humans. That's a really interesting concept. Think about it. imagine viruses, and there were some pictures, look, there's one over there, are designed by a creator being to be so intelligent that they literally can show humans where they are stepping out of harmony with their fellow beings, either other microbes or other humans. And this is what we see in the earth, where humans have certain practices that are detrimental. The most common are, for example, animal husbandry, where you get chicken pox and smallpox, where humans are living too close and too unhygienically with large amounts of animals. We create diseases that jump species. So what nature is telling us here is that if we live in particular ways that are not harmonic, that we can create very powerful diseases. And so, far from being non-beneficial, these viruses are actually beneficial because they are there for the longevity of humanity as a whole. They are showing us, how the best way it is for humans to move forward as a group and create group immunity. The way in which they do that is through contagion and entrainment. And so I'm going to give you a little analogy here. Imagine you were NASA or someone like SETI, and you wanted to start exploring extraterrestrial life in the galaxy. It's a pretty big job for one computer. But if you've got thousands of people with their computers all crunching that data and link them all together, you have one giant cloud computer. And so what human bodies do is they actually share viruses and what we call diseases in a way that human bodies start to overcome and work out how to immunologically create dynamics that will then create a level of immunity and then pass them back through the system. So what it means is, if there's a particularly virulent flu virus, what it means is different bodies will start to look at those immune systems and how they could deal with them, and the first body that comes up with an immunologically sound key or frequency can then spread that through contagion through the different communities, and then it will allow that immunity to spread. And so in this way we can look at the genetics of human beings and see a litany of contagious diseases, from tuberculosis to syphilis, that humans have conquered in the past and may have to conquer again if their ideas about who they are out of alignment with what this is. And this is very important. So the difference here between parasites and symbiotes is actually a human one. In other words, what we may think is parasitical may turn out to be the opposite. It may actually turn out to be a symbiote. I'll give you an example. If any of you go into a subtropical or tropical forest, you'll see the large climax trees, or what we call strangler figs, in the forest. Now, to most people, they're called strangler figs. It's obvious to us that a bird came along, dropped a seed in the top of this tree, it grew roots down to the earth, and from those roots began to strangle that tree, and in the end consume that tree and become a massive tree, a forest giant. And I don't know if you people know that these fig trees are literally the queens of the forest. They supply food to all the animals, monkeys and birds, 365 days a year. So they are seen as the climax trees and the mother trees of the forest. Imagine another way of looking at these trees. Imagine they were lover trees, and these two trees chose to share energy together to create the maximum opportunity for one of these mother trees to have a shot at penetrating through the canopy to form one of these living mother trees. And so what that did is that one tree gave its life to be in union with this other tree. In other words, the two trees became one in a loving embrace to create this forest giant. And so it's through our eyes that we're seeing, oh well, this tree is parasiting off this tree and killing this tree for its existence. But imagine that we could see that they were actually symbiotes. And this is really how we need to start adjusting our vision to see how we synergistically and symbiotically fit in with all of nature. And instead of going to war, develop relationships or harmonic relationships. To develop thin film awarenesses, to understand that the microbiomes or the bacteriological, viral and fungal fields are actually living consciousness fields and react to the way in which we react to them. In other words, if we go to war and we're trying to destroy them, they will create brain chemicals and immunological chemicals that will literally go to war with our systems. Whereas if we see them as co-creative beings on the planet, they start to produce a very specific set of chemicals. For example, did you know that the mushroom world, because it has to deal with the decaying and rotting matter, literally living in the breakdown or the death and decay of living systems, because these mushrooms live in those systems, they have to have an extra super special set of chemicals that allow them to live in decay without them being rotted and decayed themselves. And it's from those very exudates of those mushrooms that we have our strongest biological chemical weapons that exist on the planet. That's where penicillin comes from. It comes from a slime mold. That's where some of the strongest anti-cancer medicines are coming from today, from mushrooms. Just have a look at Paul Stamens's talks on how mushrooms can save the world, and look where some of the strongest biological medicines are coming from. They're coming from the mushroom world. Why? Is because mushrooms need to create these medicines to live in those places. So the future of human being and the living body of Earth literally is a story of how we've evolved from hunter-gatherers to hyperspace travelers and back. You know, we've moved from hunter-gatherers to agrarians and pastoralists to the industrial age, and it is literally a dead end. The only way that we could move forward as a living human community is to understand our role of creating frequencies or fields of love centrally with the human heart that literally fructifies and nourishes all living beings in all the different communities. And Bill McDonough summarized this in a question. And this could be the guiding question for all of us for how we become living earth custodians. You could literally ask the question, how do we love all children of all species for all time? How do we love all children of all species for all time? That gives us a continuum element as well as pan-species element. Everyone is included. That's what it means to be a human custodian. If you are a human custodian, you are actually caring for all living beings because we're all connected. If not, you are not actually being responsible as a human guardian of this planet. So it's up to us to form these harmonic relationships, to recognize, that these ancient cultures, as they were hunter and gatherers, needed to remain at a certain level of sensitivity to recognize these flows, to recognize these connections. Because if they didn't, their tribe would die out. And it's our modern pursuit through technology that's enabled us to become desensitized, disconnected, and more cut off from the living world. But I'm here as an emissary from this microbiological world to tell you that if we do not get our shit, our proverbial and literal shit together, we will go through one of the most traumatic periods in living history. Now, we can do this gracefully, or we can do this kicking and screaming. But literally, the Earth's defense system, through these viruses, through these fungi, through these microbiology, is there to keep us on track. And it's an all or nothing. If we do not pull this off, this could be the death of all species on the planet. And this is what we're being offered. So this is really our time. This is our time to step up as humans and become responsible human beings. Okay, so my next talk at 8:30 is going to talk about how to do that, how to create this living, loving field in your body, how that affects everyone and everything else, and how we, each one of us, can actually make the difference, not only in our local community, in the body, but globally, and affect everyone and everything really, really powerfully. So, if you'd like to come to my talk at 8:30, I'll be happy to share this information with you. And I think there may only be a couple more minutes left. If there's any questions, now's your chance.
Is that talk here?
Yes, that talk's going to be here. Yeah. I believe this talk is going to be online. We could speak to Hugh about that at some stage, but I know it's being recorded, audio and video, and so yes, it is. Anyone else? Thank you so much for your time. Thank you. And I'm clapping for my community here. But also, what I did want to say is, this amazing gentleman here, who most of you probably know, Hugh Newman. Who knew this man? We spoke together recently in a conference in South Africa. Quite amazing, but hang around and hear what this guy's got to say. Awesome stuff, and it dovetails in with my next talk. So.
Debt Free TV, in association with GetOutOfDebtFree.org.